I never expected to fall in love with my roommate, but then again, I never expected someone like Owen to walk into my life carrying a box of vintage vinyl records and wearing a smile that made my stomach flip. It was the first day of junior year, and I was sitting in our dorm room when he knocked on the already open door, even though he had every right to just walk in. That small gesture of politeness should have been my first warning that this guy was going to be different. I'm Mason, by the way, and up until that August afternoon I thought I had myself pretty well figured out. I'd dated a few girls in high school, nothing serious, and I'd convinced myself that the reason those relationships never felt quite right was just because I hadn't met the right person yet. Classic denial, looking back on it now. But when Owen stepped into that room, something shifted in me. Something I wasn't ready to name yet. He had this way of moving through space that made everything seem deliberate and careful. Dark hair that fell just slightly into his eyes, and these hands that I immediately noticed because they were always doing something, always in motion. He set down his box of records and extended one of those hands toward me. His handshake was firm and warm, and I held on maybe half a second too long. If he noticed, he didn't say anything. The first few weeks were torture in the most unexpected way. Owen was easy to live with, which somehow made everything harder. He kept his side of the room neat, but not obsessively so. He always asked before borrowing anything. He wore these soft grey t-shirts when he studied, and I found myself memorising the way they fit across his shoulders. I told myself I was just appreciating that he took care of himself, that it was normal to notice when your roommate was in good shape. The mental gymnastics I was doing could have qualified me for the Olympics. We fell into a routine quickly. Owen was a music major, and he'd practice guitar in our room sometimes, these soft melodies that filled the space between us. I was studying psychology, which in retrospect feels almost too on the nose, and I'd sit at my desk pretending to read while actually watching his fingers move across the frets. He'd catch me looking sometimes, and I'd quickly glance away, my face heating up in a way I couldn't control. About a month into the semester, Owen asked me the question that would haunt me for the next 8 months. We were both in our beds, lights off, having one of those late-night conversations that happen in college dorms when you're too tired to sleep but too wired to stop talking. We'd been discussing music, and he'd just told me about his favourite concert experience when his voice cut through the darkness. "So Mason, can I ask you something personal?" His tone was gentle, curious rather than confrontational. My heart immediately started racing. "Sure," I managed to say, trying to sound casual. "Why do you stare at me?" He asked it so simply, so without judgment, that it somehow made it worse. I'm not bothered by it or anything. I'm just genuinely curious. I felt like all the air had been sucked out of the room. My mind raced through possible responses, landing on the safest, most cowardly option available. "I don't know what you mean," I lied, and I could hear how unconvincing I sounded even to myself. There was a pause, and I could feel him thinking in the darkness. "Okay," he said finally, "but if you ever want to talk about it, I'm here." I didn't sleep that night. I lay there replaying every moment I'd been caught looking, trying to calculate how obvious I'd been, how much he'd noticed. The fact that he'd asked so kindly somehow made it worse. He wasn't accusing me of anything, he just wanted to understand, and I couldn't give him the truth because I was barely admitting it to myself. After that night, I became hyper-aware of my own gaze. I'd forced myself to look at my laptop screen when he walked by, to focus intensely on my textbook when he was getting dressed in the morning. But the awareness of him never went away. If anything, it intensified. I noticed the way he hummed under his breath when he was content, the way he'd run his hand through his hair when he was frustrated with a composition, the way his whole face transformed when he laughed at something genuinely funny. We had a lot of the same friends, which meant I couldn't avoid him even when I wanted to. Our friend group would hang out in our room or head to parties together, and I became an expert at seeming normal while internally freaking out every time Owen's arm brushed against mine, or when he'd lean in close to hear me over the music at some crowded house party. There was this one night in October, a Thursday, when most of our friends had gone home for fall break, but Owen and I had both stayed on campus. We ordered pizza and started watching a movie on his laptop, both of us sitting on his bed because it had a better angle to the desk where the laptop was propped up. About halfway through, I realised Owen had fallen asleep, his head tilted toward me, close enough that I could feel the warmth of him. I should have moved, should have gone to my own bed. Instead, I sat there frozen, barely breathing, watching the movie without processing a single scene. I was too aware of every point where we were almost touching, of the soft sound of his breathing, of the fact that I wanted nothing more than to close that tiny distance between us. That was the night I finally admitted to myself what I'd been running from. I had feelings for Owen. Real, deep, terrifying feelings. After that realization, everything got harder. I started making excuses to be out of the room more. I'd study at the library until it closed. I'd say yes to every social invitation, even ones I didn't want to attend, just to avoid being alone with him in that small space where my feelings felt too big to hide. Owen noticed. Of course he did. He'd ask if everything was okay, if he'd done something wrong, and I'd brush it off with increasingly unconvincing lies. Winter break came as a relief. 3 weeks away from Owen, 3 weeks to get my head straight, to figure out how to be a normal roommate and friend without this constant ache of wanting something I couldn't have. But being home didn't help. I'd check my phone obsessively for his messages in our group chat. I'd see something funny and think about how Owen would laugh at it. My mum asked me if I'd met someone special at school, and I'd deflected. But the question sat with me, because yes, I had met someone special, and that was the entire problem. When we got back to campus in January, something had shifted. Owen was quieter, more reserved. The easy warmth between us had cooled, and I knew it was my fault. I'd created this distance, and now I didn't know how to close it without exposing everything I was trying to hide. We were polite roommates now instead of friends, and it killed me. February was the worst month. Owen started seeing someone, a girl from his music theory class named Sarah. She was nice, objectively pretty, talented. Everything that made sense for someone like Owen. She'd come by our room sometimes and I'd make excuses to leave, to give them privacy. When what I really couldn't handle was watching him be affectionate with someone else, watching him look at her with attention and care and knowing that I'd been pushing him away for months while desperately wanting to pull him closer. They broke up in March. Owen didn't talk to me about it, which hurt more than I wanted to admit. We'd once been the kind of friends who talked about everything, and now we were strangers who happened to share a room. I wanted to ask if he was okay, wanted to be there for him, but I'd burned that bridge with my own fear and confusion. April brought the announcement that room selection for senior year was opening soon. Owen mentioned casually one morning that he was planning to room with some guys from the music department. He said it while making coffee, not even looking at me, and I felt something crack inside my chest. I just nodded, said that made sense, and left for class early so he wouldn't see my face. That's when it really hit me. I'd spent 8 months so terrified of my feelings that I'd destroyed one of the best friendships I'd ever had. I'd pushed away someone who'd only ever been kind to me, who'd tried to reach out and understand, and now I was losing him entirely. Not because he didn't care, but because I'd made it impossible for him to keep trying. I started seeing the campus counsellor. Not specifically about Owen, or at least that's what I told myself at first, but about figuring out who I was and what I wanted. Dr. Chen was patient and non-judgmental, and slowly, over several sessions, I started to untangle the mess of feelings I'd been carrying. I talked about the relationships that never felt right, about the fear of disappointing my family, about Owen and how I'd sabotaged something good because I was too scared to be honest. She asked me what I was more afraid of, Owen rejecting me or accepting me. I didn't have an answer, which she said was an answer in itself. May arrived with the kind of spring weather that makes everything feel possible and bittersweet at the same time. Finals were approaching, and the campus had that end-of-year energy where everyone's both stressed and nostalgic. Owen and I had barely spoken in weeks beyond basic roommate logistics. The silence in our room was oppressive, filled with everything I'd never said. Move-out day was set for May 15th, right after our last finals. I'd already started packing, putting my life into boxes, when Owen came back from his last exam. He looked exhausted, his hair messy from running his hands through it, his t-shirt wrinkled. He dropped his backpack and just stood there looking at the half-packed room. "So this is really it," he said quietly. "We're really just going to pretend this year never happened." My hands stilled on the box I was packing. "What do you mean?" "Mason, come on. We were friends. Good friends. And then something changed. And you won't tell me what. And now we're just going to go our separate ways like we were never anything to each other." The frustration in his voice broke something loose in me. All the fear, all the careful control I'd maintained for 8 months, it just crumbled. "I'm in love with you," I said, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. That's why I stare. That's why I've been weird. That's why I pushed you away. Because I'm in love with you, and I didn't know how to deal with that, and I'm sorry. I'm so sorry I ruined everything." The silence that followed felt eternal. Owen just stood there, staring at me, and I couldn't read his expression. I wanted to take it back, to somehow rewind the last 30 seconds, but the truth was out there now, and there was no going back. Then Owen crossed the room in 3 long steps and kissed me. Just kissed me. His hands coming up to frame my face, and for a second I was too shocked to respond. But then my brain caught up with what was happening, and I kissed him back, 8 months of longing pouring into that moment. His lips were soft and sure, and he tasted like coffee and mint, and it was everything I'd imagined and nothing like I'd expected because it was real. When we finally broke apart, we were both breathing hard. Owen rested his forehead against mine, his hands still cradling my face like I was something precious. "You absolute idiot," he said, but he was smiling. "I've been waiting for you to figure it out since October." "October?" My voice came out strangled. "That night we watched the movie and I fell asleep on your shoulder." I was totally faking. I wanted to see what you'd do, and you just sat there, barely breathing, and I thought maybe you felt the same way. But then you started avoiding me, and I thought I'd read it all wrong. "You dated Sarah," I said, still trying to process what was happening, "because you were pushing me away and I was trying to convince myself I could have feelings for someone else. It lasted 3 weeks, Mason. 3 weeks of me comparing everything she did to you and realizing I was being completely unfair to her. When you asked me why I stared, I started, but he cut me off with another kiss. Shorter this time, but no less intense. I know why you couldn't answer. I get it now. I'm sorry I pushed. I just needed you to know that I saw you, and whatever you were feeling, it was safe with me." I pulled back enough to look at him properly. His eyes were bright, hopeful, and I realized I'd been so caught up in my own fear that I'd never considered this possibility. That Owen might feel the same way, that my feelings might not be this shameful secret, but something that could be shared, reciprocated, celebrated. "So what now?" I asked, because our room was half packed, and we'd already made plans to live separately next year. "Now," Owen said, his thumb tracing along my jawline in a way that made me shiver. "We finish packing, we go home for the summer, and we figure this out together because I'm not letting you run away from this, from us. I'm done running," I promised, and I meant it. For the first time in 8 months, I felt like I could breathe properly. We spent the rest of move-out day packing together, but everything was different now. Owen would catch my hand as I walked past, pull me in for a quick kiss. I'd lean against him while we argued about the best way to pack his record collection. We talked about everything we'd been holding back, all the moments we'd both noticed and misinterpreted and hoped over. As we loaded the last boxes into our cars, Owen pulled me aside. His fingers laced through mine, and the simple gesture felt revolutionary. "I'm really glad you told me the truth," he said, "even if it took you 8 months. "I'm glad you didn't give up on me," I replied, squeezing his hand. "Never," he said simply, and kissed me one more time in that empty dorm room where everything had started. Driving away from campus that day, I kept checking my phone at red lights, reading and rereading the messages Owen was sending from his car ahead of mine. Silly things, song recommendations and bad jokes, but each one made me smile. I'd spent so long afraid of my own feelings, convinced that loving Owen would mean losing everything. But standing in that truth, scary as it had been, had given me everything I'd been too afraid to hope for. The summer stretched ahead of us, full of possibility. We had a lot to figure out, conversations to have with family and friends, logistics to work through. But for the first time since Owen had walked into my life carrying that box of records, I wasn't afraid. I was in love, and miraculously, wonderfully, he loved me back. And that truth, finally spoken, had set us both free.